our series of seminars on topics related to Cuba in association with the International Institute for the Study of Cuba at the University of Buckingham, organised by the Humanities Research Institute. And it's a really great privilege and a pleasure to introduce Dr. George Lambie, with whom I've worked on and off for very many years in things Cuban. But recently, George, who is a specialist in international political economy, has been working in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong, and in particular looking at China's rise and its Belt and Road Initiative. So we've asked him to come along today to talk about the Belt and Road and the implications this has for the Latin American region and in particular Cuba. So thanks, George, and it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'd first of all like to welcome those people who've joined the seminar, and also to thank Dr. Wilkinson and his colleagues for organising this event. A couple of things about myself. It's the first time I've actually done a lecture in this form. I've actually pre-recorded them previously. I've run seminars on Zoom before, but giving a lecture is a new experience for me. I should also mention that it's midnight here, or just gone midnight in Hong Kong, so somebody click their fingers if I fall asleep at any stage. So anyway, what I've done with this series of slides, which I'll try and get through in 40 minutes or a bit less if possible, is that they're quite dense. There's quite a lot of information on them. I'll put the first one up. Wait a moment. Sorry. Yeah, this one here. And the reason I've done that is because there's quite a lot of material on the Belt and Road. I didn't know whether people were familiar with this initiative or how much knowledge you had. So I'm going to have a few introductory slides before I move on to various aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'll go through them fairly quickly. I'm not going to read them out or anything like that, but there is some information there for you for those who maybe have not had much previous knowledge of the Belt and Road Initiative. So first of all, to start off with, it's been called various names. Most of them are quite awkward. At the moment, it's the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Before it was the One Belt, One Road, Silk Road Economic Belt, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. It was first launched in 2013 when President Xi visited Indonesia and Kazakhstan. And obviously, it's a concept going back even thousands of years, in fact, 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty. When the beginning of a network of connections of roads ran out of China across Central Asia, through the Middle East, and to Europe and to the Mediterranean. I read a book some time back, Frank Capan's book, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, which I would recommend anyone read if they want to kind of have the background to this. And I think the title is very appropriate, this idea of a new history of the world, because when one reads the book, you realize the extent of these trading routes and the complexity and the immense period in history that they covered and how important they were. So it was only really with the end of the Cold War that the possibility opened up of this kind of east-west connectivity again. And I've been doing some research recently on the Iran-China deal that has recently been agreed. I was amazed to find out some of the statistics on Central Asia and South Asia and so on. And these places seem to have been isolated for many times, and the connections are very poor. And the whole thing about the Belt and Road is to try and really build up this connectivity. So the Silk Road Economic Belt is a transcontinental passage that links China with Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Russia and Europe by land. And the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road is a sea route connecting China's coastal regions with Southeast and South Asia, the South Pacific, Middle East and Eastern Africa, all the way to Europe. And also recently, there's the concept of an Arctic Silk Road that was mentioned in 2017. And envisages a passage along Russia's northern coast, where the ice melt is occurring at the greatest speed, and also Russia's now got some very sophisticated icebreakers. So these are all approaches, which I shall mention later, to really that go across Central Asia, the Middle East, and arrive at Europe. And I think for China, the real prize, as it was in the past, is to make the connection with Europe, which is obviously probably one of the most powerful economic areas, well, is the most powerful economic area in the world. The Belt and Roads and geographical reach is constantly expanding, and I'll just read this out. With 131 countries signing on and more than 575 billion worth of investments mobilized, the Belt and Road Initiative could mark a paradigm shift in infrastructure development around the world. It includes ports, roads, railways, airports, power plants, telecommunications networks, and also reaches out as well to Oceania, Latin America, and South and West Africa. So really, it is a global project. It's not just a project that reaches out across Asia to Europe. Okay, so one of the things we need to think about when we talk about the Belt and Road as well is China's matrix of alternative institutions, which could include the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is really kind of a big security organization, corporation, of which I can't remember how many members there are now, key members being Russia and China. The cross-border interbank payment system, SIPS, which is a kind of interbank payment system, which is probably will replace in the Federal Wire and SWIFT and various dollar-based kind of payment systems. Then the BRICS, which we all know about, the BRICS nation, which are probably not quite as important as they were, or the BRICS Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And this is the kind of what I would call not the alternative, but the parallel architecture to what has been called the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc. So moving on to slide 2, is the stated objectives of the BRI to construct a unified large market and make full use of both international and domestic markets through cultural exchange and integration, to enhance mutual understanding and trust of member nations, ending up in an innovative pattern with capital inflows, talent pool, a technology database, a community of common destiny, and it has this kind of wider objective, the problems facing mankind. Now, obviously, it's a very practical project, but it also locks in some ways to, China's grand ambition as articulated in the so-called China Dream and so on. So this is the kind of China's escape from what it's called the 100 years of humiliation, mainly at the hands of the West. And now China on the rise has got a kind of historical mission in which is not only to re-establish the trading routes across Central Asia to Europe, but also to, if you like, address the problems of humanity at the same time. Obviously, I'm saying this without kind of promoting that idea, but the whole thing comes as a kind of package which is both commercial and ideological. Chinese government's official statement on the BRI is to promote the connectivity of Asian, European, African continents and their adjacent seas, establish and strengthen partnerships among the countries along the Belt and Road, set up all-dimensional, multi-tiered and composite connectivity networks, and realize diversified, independent, balanced and sustainable development in these countries. Well, these are grand statements that, any big project would have something similar. But in some ways, I think, these are targets which are quite real, but as we'll see later, quite difficult to attain. The initiative defines 5 major priorities. One is policy coordination, which is probably going to be the most difficult ones. Multi-level intergovernmental macro policy exchange, communications mechanism. When we think about this, we've got to think about the diversity of the countries that it's crossing, the Kazakhstans and Syria and Iran, and all very diverse countries to the extent that some of them run on even different rail gauges and so on. They have very different institutional frameworks, different religions, different languages and so on. So, this policy coordination process and the coordination of anything else is immensely complex. Facilities, connectivity, infrastructure, technical standard systems. One thing you might bring out of this is, what sort of accounting system? Is it going to be a general accounting system they use? Are they going to use international accounting standards, or is it going to be something coming out of China? That's not my specialist area, but one can imagine the problems of bringing all these things together. The other idea is unimpeded trade, reduction in investment trade barriers, promotion of regional cooperation. Well, as long as nations are working together and not in conflict, then that might be possible. Financial integration, that is a very complex and very controversial area, because it's not just about having common standards of banking and all this sort of thing. It's about also, which currency are they going to trade in? One of the objectives of the Belt and Road Initiative is to really operate to a large extent outside of the US dollar system, because the US dollar system the Chinese believe has been weaponized with sanctions and, de-swifting of countries, in other words, taking away their possibility for interbank connections and so on. So the general view is that, there is going to be increasing use of the Chinese renminbi. There's also going to be increasing opportunities for barter and various mechanisms that allow China and its partners in the BRI to operate outside the United States dominated dollar system. And we can see this certainly at the moment in the recent China-Iran deal, where Iran has been sanctioned since the 1980s. And of course, that economy has been stalled for many, many years, unable to develop. But, with this new deal with China, there may be more possibilities of actually trading and operating outside of the dollar system and working in other currencies. People-to-people bonds, we're probably all familiar with the Confucius Institutes. I used to have one at my old university in Leicester. So, cultural, academic exchanges, dialogues, media cooperation, and so on. So it's a fairly comprehensive set of objectives to bring together this, this globally ambitious project, shall we say. So I'm actually reading some of this off my other computer screen, so I find it easier. So if I'm looking away from the screen, then I'm not distracted. So what does this mean to China? I think we've got to put this in some sort of perspective. In developmental terms, it represents the transition from a low-wage offshore manufacturer for Western markets to become a high-tech, high-added value producer for domestic and foreign markets in which its economic activities need to be integrated at a global level. And the reasons for this are, first of all, a continuous and reliable supply of resources through participating nations. China is an enormous, because of its size, is an enormous consumer, and the degree of the amount of production. It is a producer nation, not so much like the West, which is becoming increasingly financialized, etc., and deindustrialized. China is a massive industrial producer nation, so it needs to secure resources. It can't be running out of copper or whatever it uses in various metals, or it's also got a large degree of control of a lot of these resources itself in its own country. Also, it needs a trading and investment area open to international competition, but not dominated by one power and the prevailing currency system, as I've already mentioned. Option for nations to trade, invest, and raise finance in renminbi. Also, outlet for huge foreign currency reserve. China has got huge reserves in foreign currency, and it uses them often to invest in these projects, and at the same time offload those currencies which may not want to hold so much of, including the dollar. Also a reliable and growing market for Chinese products, especially the new high-tech products, as well as areas of excess capacity. China's construction has been absolutely extraordinary. I tried to embed in this series of slides a kind of a helicopter trip over a motorway which runs from China to Pakistan, and it's completely mind-boggling. How did they construct this thing through the mountains and so on? So, Chinese construction is really completely amazing and happens at very high speed. One of the reasons for this, of course, they don't have to go to all sorts of committees and, political approvals and things like that. They can just go ahead and do it. Also, a zone in which production can be stratified in the sense that China can move its low-tech, export-orientated, FDI-driven productive activities to other countries with lower levels of development. For example, in Vietnam, there's been quite a few articles come out in the West that talk about, China's losing its industry to other places, but China does have an internal strategy to move on those kind of low value, high labor intensive kind of industries, because it can move it to other parts of the world. And this is not necessarily exploitative. Probably Vietnam and some other countries welcome this. And in fact, that's one of the things he's got in mind for Iran, which has had very little investment, that Chinese companies could set up factories there, perhaps in conjunction with Iranian entrepreneurs, and the relatively low cost of labor and so on. That could be quite profitable for those who are investing, and probably quite good for Iran as well. And also one thing that I think is crucial from my sort of international political economy perspective is the reintroduction of the concept of development into a stalled global economy, reinvigorating economic growth and social opportunities. I think that, with the rise of globalization in the 1970s and 80s, we we sort of replaced development with this notion of competitive insertion in the global economy, foreign direct investment, which, the development theories of previous times of structuralism, dependency theory, all of this sort of thing, which assume that former colonial countries and developing countries generally would need a space in which they could protect their economies while they engage in some form of import substitution, industrialization. Well, that sort of thinking seems ended possibly with the Brandt report. Seems to have kicked out really, and the view is now it's attracting foreign direct investment. But when one studies foreign direct investment, in many cases, the positive impact on some economies is very weak because of the nature of the organization of global production chains, etc., and the way that some of these investments are organized. One author states on a positive note, the infrastructure facilities built under the initiative would definitely enhance local and regional connectivity of the host countries, and when combined with attempts at local industrialization facilitated by the new opportunities of trade and exchanges and funded by China or otherwise, it would offer the best chance for lifting local populations out of the trap of isolation, poverty and marginalization. What I would say about this is that, certainly South Asia, Southeast Asia, some very poor countries there and so on have really not developed very much, over the past 30, 40 years. So, maybe there's quite a lot of space for development to take place and being connected particularly to some wider project, which has all of its infrastructure and railways and roads and things like that. One can imagine would open up opportunities for parts of Asia which have not had them before. Here I've got a map of the, which I mean, there are so many of these things, but this is just one, shows, some of the routes. I'm not going to go through those, but overland routes, the Maritime Route. With the Maritime Route, you can see that it does pass through the Suez and along the Red Sea. And one of the reasons that China has developed quite strong relations with Djibouti, which has probably not got a lot to offer really in many respects, is that it's established a military base there. It also might have a railway that goes out of Djibouti into Africa. It's also established very good relations with Greece. The port of Piraeus in Athens, for example, has got a huge amount of Chinese investment. And we're talking here about connectivity. There are quite a lot of choke points along this route, and the deal with Iran might give China some greater possibilities of controlling trade and doing various other things. So there are many if you look along here, it looks great, but there are many problems of making all these connections worth, both physical problems, political problems, cultural problems, all kinds of things. But still, that is the general plan. And also I've inserted in here the Arctic, the Polar Silk Road. So the BRI is really kind of structured into a series of corridors, which I'm not going to talk about in detail. If you look at the map here, you can see is the China-Pakistan corridor, which is probably one of the most difficult ones in many respects, because of the geography in northern Pakistan, northeastern Pakistan, which is quite dramatic and difficult. There's the new Eurasia land bridge, which you can see there. That's coming out of China and then really straight across Central Asia. The China-Mongolia-Russia bridge, okay, that's one to the north. The China, it's not really been used that much at the moment. And the China-Indochina Peninsula, and then the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, and then finally the China, Central Asia, West Asia. So there are various routes here that are corridors, as they call them. I've got a sort of few links that can take you to discussions on these corridors. I'm not going to go into all of these, perhaps just the first one, the new Eurasian land bridge, series of rail corridors running 7,500 miles from Yue in eastern China through Xinjiang province, autonomous region, Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Poland, reaching Western European destinations like Duisburg, Madrid and London. The trip takes 2 weeks. Almost 4,000 trains a year since 2018, claimed it moves 100,000 containers a year, but we have to bear in mind that Shanghai ships 100,000 a day. So, this has got to be kept in perspective in some ways, that at the moment, shipping is far more efficient and far greater in volume than anything that can be sent, by rail or road across Central Asia, etc. So I'm going to start looking now at the various sort of components of this, and the first one I'll look at is this is a relatively minor component, but it's something worth mentioning because a lot of talk is about infrastructure and so on, and various investments. But China's also got what you might call a semi-soft power element in here, which is a health Silk Road, and while this was thought about initially with the development of the Belt and Road, it was obviously, accelerated with the COVID pandemic. And one of the problems of global integration is rapid transfer of diseases we know now. And so, China has kind of tried to fit into this initiative something which considers the question of health, which I think if there's really going to be some serious connections between a lot of these countries, this is probably a very good idea. So the Pan-Eurasian health connectivity envisaged as part of the BRI 217, but as I say, COVID has accelerated that. In mid-March 2020, President Xi promised Prime Minister Conte of Italy not only to send medical support teams to Italy, but also to accelerate the health Silk Road. Italy was the first European nation to sign a memorandum of understanding to join the BRI. China is now assisting 89 other nations with COVID-19. The other European nation to join the BRI is also Portugal. And I'm hoping in the near future to actually interview some people in both Italy and Portugal to see, what reasoning lies behind them. I mean, obviously, you can think of very good reasons for the join to BRI, but what it implies and what reasoning there is there. One point I've made here, which is related to the Health Silk Road, is the kind of contradictory connection, because since the late 1990s, China has taken an interest in Italian fashion, invested heavily in the fashion industry, particularly in the Lombardy region. And this has resulted in large-scale production outsourcing mainly to Wuhan, and the migration of 300,000 Chinese to Italy to work as the Made in Italy factories. So Italy and Wuhan started to show signs of COVID-19 at the same time, but for the former did not identify them until later. So, one of the early problems with Italy, as you remember, with COVID is that, it suddenly seemed to attack the country very vigorously. So beside aid to Italy, China, in a humanitarian but symbolic gesture, sent a train from Yue in eastern China, which carried 110 medical masks and protective suits, etc., 13,000 kilometers in 17 days. But again, some of these things are quite symbolic, because the Jack Ma Foundation sends 5 times as many masks to Spain, but more quickly by air. So there's a lot of symbolism in this kind of Belt and Road and the way that they develop things, but, good intentions nevertheless. Cuba could possibly play an interesting role here. I've tried to do some research on this, but the problem is with China and Cuba, a lot of the things that they do together, and there is quite a lot of activity between them, is that it's not really advertised a great deal, and you can understand why it isn't. But there are certainly quite a lot of things going on, and I think that if one considers the health systems of a lot of the countries that the Belt and Road is going to pass through, then Cuba's experience could be absolutely invaluable, because a lot of those countries are probably at similar levels to the development of Venezuela, have probably not got really very good healthcare systems, and the kind of Cuban approach to healthcare, which is really, based on emphasis on primary care and so on, and participation in healthcare, and a very efficient, very sort of, people-centered structure rather than a kind of medical-centered structure, I think could be, not only very good as a health system for a lot of countries. For example, the Cubans have been to Pakistan and many other countries in the region and worked there. And I think for these countries as they develop, Cuba's knowledge could be absolutely invaluable. And also, from a more sort of practical point of view, the one thing that Cuba's able to do is to deliver some very efficient and a very economical healthcare. So this is another consideration for countries which are essentially not very well off, or large proportions of the population are not very well off. When I read this statement I'm going to read to you now, I always question it, but apparently it is true. Cuba's international contribution to the capacity building of health workers is on a scale exceeding that of all the members of the G8 group of leading advanced countries combined. So if that's true, then Cuba could offer a lot to China along the Belt and Road. And also, as I mentioned previously, the experience Cuba has with country-wide projects. I did some research in Venezuela in 2006 on the Barrio Adentro program in Venezuela, and it was astonishing. There were sort of 6,000 Cubans, sort of going backwards and forwards all the time between Cuba and Venezuela, and they were basically constructing a completely new health service in Venezuela. With that kind of ability and capacity and skill, then I imagine Cuba could play an absolutely fundamental role in the Belt and Road. There's the digital Silk Road as well. I'm not going to go through this in detail because there's a lot of wordage here, but you can read it. But I think the one thing we should probably think about here is that China's level of development is much closer to the level of development of many of the countries it's passing through. It's new. China was 20 years ago, it was pretty much a developing country in many respects, and really very sort of low GDP per capita, etc. And it has moved forward at a tremendous pace. So China has incorporated new technologies, very quickly indeed. And if you go to places like Africa, or as I'll point out later on Latin America, I think China's experience with technology and applying it to sort of social development and applying it to microfinancing and all of those sorts of things. They really have kind of, their development has not been so much about kind of, just the usual things we associate with development, but it's been quite a high-tech development, moving from relative underdevelopment to a new high-tech world. And I think that compatibility with other countries is something which is quite significant. So they make a big show of the digital Silk Road, and some of the ideas in this are quite practical, and they're already occurring in China, is that if people can kind of, have communications through Wi-Fi and so on, and the mobile phones, etc., they can set up businesses, advertise their wares. Somebody who's probably out in the middle of nowhere in Kazakhstan can, somehow kind of advertise that they're doing certain things and make some connection with a trader, and the trader can take it to, a market or whatever it might be. So, this increased connectivity could be quite positive, really. So, and that's certainly an area that's worth doing some further research in, and I know quite a lot of Chinese people have done a lot of work on this. I'm not going to go through this again, but you can see here some of the digital Silk Road projects, which are quite extensive all over the world. And, China is so good at this sort of level of technology where it actually sorts of integrates with, with economic development at certain stages. So particularly in Africa, the use of kind of smartphones to make payments and things like that, and also microcredits and loans, and this is quite extraordinary, really, almost outside the banking system altogether. So let's just have a look at Latin America and the Belt and Road, because Latin America seems a bit off-piste when we look at the maps, but it is an area which is seriously important to China, and China has got massive investments in Latin America. Today, 18 of the 33 countries in Latin America have joined the Belt and Road Initiative, and Brazil is obviously a member of the BRICS. Bilateral trade has grown 25 times, from 12 billion in 1999 to 306 billion in 2018. I couldn't get the most recent figure. Placing China as Latin America's second largest trading partner after the United States, which is absolutely, astonishing, really, that this has all happened in such a short time. Latin America's economic performance, and probably some of you know something about Latin America, there's the sort of, the debt crisis of the 1980s and the so-called lost decade. And in some ways it was China's development and takeoff that really had quite an impact on Latin America, because China pushed up commodity prices and produced huge demand for commodities and so on. And this had an impact on Latin America. And this is really where the kind of trade between China and Latin America started. China proclaims that it doesn't become involved in politics, non-interventionist, doesn't mess about with the internal affairs of other countries, only seeks commercial relations based on a win-win basis. And I think to a large extent this is true. But in Latin America, it's found that some of its best partners are those who are not subscribed to the Washington consensus. So countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and China has also supported such initiatives as the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, ALBA, and so on. And so I don't know whether it's kind of by default or whatever, but certainly China tends to get on best with those countries that are if you like, resistant to the Washington consensus, and that's probably quite understandable because Washington puts a lot of pressure on countries that are collaborating with China, as we saw quite recently in Bolivia, which had a coup and the leader was expelled, even though that party's now back in power again. What are the advantages for Latin America? Investment markets, supposedly no political interference, compatible development profile, as I mentioned before, China's tech boom, microfinance and payment through mobile networks, etc. Possibility to trade outside of the US dollar system, very interesting in Brazil and Bolivia have connected with China, Brazil through yuan trade, and Bolivia really through barter. I mean, barter is a very effective mechanism if you want to kind of evade the international dollar system. The region also has 200 million smartphone users, second fastest growing mobile market in the world, behind sub-Saharan Africa. Mobile technology, 5% of the region's GDP, and generated 280 billion in economic value 2018. What are the problems? Well, Latin America's problem has always been one really of dependency and a primary producer and, foreign powers coming in and kind of exploiting those resources. Excuse me. So the exports of low value added, highly priced volatile commodities, price volatile commodities that employ relatively few people, intensification of big agribusiness. So China imports huge amounts of soya and various other crops. Is this kind of reinforcing the kind of the structures that already exist in Latin America, run by kind of export-orientated oligarchies? That needs to be questioned. A lot of these products are GMO. I'm not clear at the moment whether actually China, what its attitude is to GMO. And the destruction of rural livelihoods reinforces pro-Western oligarchy, because Latin America has tended to have this kind of ruling elite that have survived from the conquest through all kinds of governments, dictatorships, democracies, whatever you might like, and really what has been called the Triple Alliance, which is foreign investment, the ruling oligarchies and the military have kind of managed to keep an elitist power structure going in Latin America. And when challenged, as in the case of Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, these countries then face the wrath of the international system. Is China? It's participating with organizations like ALBA, which are not very strong these days because of the fall in oil price and Venezuela's problems and so on. It's got strong links with Cuba, but at the same time, do its commercial enterprises simply reinforce the dependency and the existing political structure of Latin America? I mean, that's an open question. I don't really have too much opinion on that. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to Cuba, China, and the Belt and Road. China-Cuba cooperation. Cuba. A lot of Chinese arrived as indentured labor in Cuba in the 19th century. Chinese diaspora, those who've been to Havana have probably been to Chinatown, etc. There are quite a lot of Chinese people all over Cuba. Cuba was the first in Latin America to form diplomatic relations with China in 1960. By 2017, China was Cuba's largest trading partner with 1.8 billion in trade. Okay, it joined the BRI in 2019. I remember being, and probably Steve will remember this as well, being in Havana in sort of, maybe 2000, 2001, huge amounts of bicycles in Cuba, because kind of China came to some extent to the rescue after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and and then kind of started certainly from 2000 onward playing an increasingly important role with Cuba. The two countries have pursued state-led cooperation in sectors such as transformation, biomedicine, tourism, industrial manufacturing, nickel and oil mining, and oil refining for many years. As with Iran and a number of other countries, these arrangements are not fully revealed. As I said before, it's they keep them fairly quiet, basically, not releasing information on arrangements. In China, Cuba has collaborative ventures mainly in the medical field. For example, the Cuban Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology was established recently in Hunan province in central China, dedicated to developing Cuban products for use in China and perhaps the Belt and Road countries. And we've got to remember here that Cuba does produce some very sophisticated drugs and very sophisticated medical procedures. So this is not kind of a charity. This is, Cuba seriously contributing to China's health system. Cuba and China jointly manage the Changchun Hebe biological technology joint venture, opened in 2003. Cuban-made nimotuzumab R3 monoclonal antibody, which is used to treat brain tumors. And that sentence alone gives you an idea of how advanced Cuba's medicine is. And also Cuba's interferon alpha-2b has been used for treatment of COVID in China. There's an interesting comment which I picked up here. In Cuba, Cuba provides its archipelago to be China's command post in the Americas. Well, I think I would agree with this to some extent, because I remember being in Cuba many years ago, and a Chinese premier, I can't remember, Hu Jintao probably, visited Cuba. And he was visiting Latin America, but had to call to Havana first to almost get his calling card for the rest of the continent. And I think China uses Cuba in this sense that there's a great respect for Cuba in most of Latin America, particularly its oppositional role to the United States, the Washington Consensus, the Organization of American States, etc. And so, in some ways, China gains some credibility by having a good association with Cuba. And I'm sure, there's tremendous compatibility and there's genuine good relations between the countries. But, by visiting Cuba, then sort of China says to the rest of Latin America, well, look, we're the good guys. We're not going to exploit you. We're in with the Cubans, or, some sort of signal like that. It's probably quite important. President Xi wrote to Raul Castro, I have the willingness to maintain close communications with you, as together we write a new chapter of Chinese-Cuban friendship in a new era. So, as I say, Cuba's special, kind of credentials in some ways. Chinese companies are in Mariel Special Development Zone. China is assisting with the transition from analog to digital television, the expansion of mobile broadband, led by the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei, and the creation of Artificial Intelligence Center. Also, Chinese oil companies helping Cuba's national oil company, CUPET, for, oil kind of discovery and so on. As I noted earlier, I think that, Cuba could be a major contributor to China's BRI health Silk Road. China itself has, a reasonable healthcare system in many respects, but I don't think really it's appropriate for export. So a country like Cuba, with its immense experience, as I mentioned before, its immense skills, could play a very important role there. And I think it would be worth keeping an eye on this because clearly the future is going to open up quite a few possibilities for Cuba. In fact, I think Cuba's future is linked both to Latin America and also to China and what I would call the multipolar world. So this, I think, will enrage the United States even more than it is enraged, but there we are. Okay, criticisms of the BRI, because I've kind of given a fairly sort of, bland message here, but criticism mainly from the Western opposition, because as we know, I'm not in the West now, but when I'm there, I know that they're constantly on the television and so on, there's criticism of China and Russia, and it's kind of, gone off the scale at the moment. So, what are the main kind of challenges to the Belt and Road? Claims are hundreds of billions spent by China on BRI cannot produce return for investors, nor political returns in Beijing. Sovereign debt of the 27 BRICS BRI countries regarded as junk by the three main rating agencies, while the other 14 have no rating at all. Ports built on the Indian Ocean coastline have no hope of financial success. 270 BRI infrastructure projects in the region, 32% of the total value of the whole, have been put on hold because of the problems with practicality or financial viability. Vast gap between what China declares it will spend, what they do spend. BRI projects are not centrally directed. This is true because quite a lot of it, they're managed by lower state bodies and provincial bodies. And this is a bit of a problem because China's quite decentralized in many respects. And therefore, it depends on the local authority that's managing this project or the construction company that comes from a certain region. So there is a lack of coordination. I think there's some truth in that. Already existing projects are being brought under the BRI brand to enhance its prestige, possibly. Only 12% of Chinese foreign direct investment is aimed to the countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. And 1/3 of it goes to developed countries, South Korea, Israel, Singapore. Hold on a minute, Israel? Yeah, China virtually controls the port of Haifa in Israel. So this is quite an interesting, even the Israelis have kind of succumbed to the Chinese temptation. Large state-owned enterprises and government agencies provide more than 90% of the BRI funding. BRI is not a brand investors trust. Well, I mean, this is this is one of the debates that is kind of a bit ideological in some ways because they're not necessarily private firms. Then they're condemned. But some of the state-owned enterprises in China are not sort of great big languishing giants, but really some of them have got tremendous experience in working abroad and building projects and so on. So they're not quite as some people might imagine. Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, described the BRI project as a new form of colonialism, must be rejected. Bangladeshi authorities have blacklisted China Harbour Engineering Company, etc. And the other claim is BRI investments threaten to drive some countries towards default. The central government is not willing to be the lender of last resort. Well, a friend of mine who I see quite frequently here in Hong Kong gave a response at SOAS a while back at a conference, and he said, well, if you study how investments are made by all countries in the world, that there has to be some conditionality, and if countries do fail or borrowers do start to fail to pay back, then there have to be some measures. So the BRI investments are not charity. They're not aid necessarily. They are business ventures, and how they are managed, I don't think is possibly any worse than some of the Western ones. What I'd like to move on to now, I don't know how we are for time, but and if you can tell me if I've only got 10 minutes left, if you wouldn't mind, Steve.
Yeah,
okay.
You've got about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Well, I'll go pretty quickly now. Unipolarity, multipolarity. This is my area. This is what I'm particularly interested in. The political and geostrategic objections to China's expansions. Many Americans fear that the Belt and Road Initiative is an extension of efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to undermine the security and economic architecture of the international order. China's growing largesse, they worry, comes largely at the expense of international institutions and American influence. I asked my students here to actually read the speeches by Deputy President Mike Pence, because all of a sudden, China, which was seen to be, there were criticism and so on, all of a sudden became, put into some sort of enemy camp. And I'm not going to go through all of these here, but just to mention a few. Interference economically and politically in domestic affairs of the United States and spreading propaganda in the US. Well, that's highly debatable. Contesting America's geopolitical advantages and trying to change the international order in their favor. Well, I think China's trying to sort of build its own kind of space, really, in some respects. Theft of American technology, etc. Religious intolerance and persecution of minorities. Maybe not so much seen from this part of the world. The suppression of Hong Kong and US offering support for protesters, etc. That they're doing something here. That's quite controversial here, obviously. And also there's a condemnation of unfair trading practices. The speech is worth listening to because it does mark a dramatic shift away from, China, the darling of the West, to becoming, this kind of implacable enemy. Now, what I want to do briefly here, and I've got a lot of material on this, but I just want to kind of quickly go through this. The title of this has been a kind of new empire or whatever, China. I want to kind of turn this question around a little bit because really, we all go back to Fukuyama's statement a long time ago, the end of history, and George Bush's statement, 1991 speech, a new world order, etc. And some writers like Krauthammer said that it has been assumed that the old bipolar world would beget a multipolar world with power dispersed to the new centers, Japan, Germany, and or Europe, China, and a diminished Soviet Union. This is mistaken. The immediate post-war world is not multipolar, it is unipolar. The center of world power is an unchallenged superpower, the United States, attended by its Western allies. The unipolar moment. Okay, so the idea was, after the collapse of the Cold War, that's the end of history. This is the unipolar moment. It's all going to be running in the direction of kind of, a neoliberal conception of economics and of democracy and history generally. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, 1992, classified defense document, articulating ideas of Paul Wolfowitz, the Pentagon's Undersecretary for Policy, was leaked to the New York Times. Convince potential competitors they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. The United States should be postured to act independently when collective action cannot be orchestrated, must maintain the mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. We can understand why Pence is upset there for his speech. Rejects collective diplomacy and places Europe in a subservient position. Now, this brings me to, again, very briefly skipping over these things, the Brzezinski Doctrine. Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to President Carter, advised the subsequent US governments, outstanding international relations theorist, published in 1986, Game Planetary, a Strategic Framework Conduct of US-Soviet Contest. In 1997, he published this book, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives, a book really worth reading. It's incredibly interesting. He states how the US manages this chessboard will be critical to the longevity and stability of America's global primacy. He also states in here, and if we look at the map at the left-hand side, if the middle space can be drawn increasingly into the expanding orbit of the West, where America preponderates, if the southern region is not subjected to domination by a single player, and if the East is not unified in a manner that prompts the expulsion of America from its offshore bases, America can be said to prevail. But if the middle space rebuffs the West, becomes assertive single entity, and either gains control over the South or forms an alliance with the major Eastern actor, then America's primacy in Eurasia shrinks dramatically. The two greatest fears are that Russia and China would unite to control Asia and possibly drawing in Europe, and secondly, well, something which anarchy prevailing after the collapse of communism. However, by 2003 and so on, there was still a great deal of confidence. The New York Times Sunday magazine cover for January 5th, 2003 read, American Empire, get used to it. The problem is with China's rise, and here I talk about hegemony or multipolarity, is that this end of history idea, the time the most favored nation treaty was signed by the United States and China in 1999, in my view, that the West felt that China was developing rapidly, became the kind of, the darling of the West, large amounts of foreign investment moving there, and there was no reason to question whether it would join the international community and join this kind of unipolar order. I'm sure that it was thought in the West that the Chinese elites would kind of just direct China into this international, transnational, deterritorialized global system, and that it would therefore, become part of that system. The problem is that by the end, even though China started off from a low base, by the end of 2018, China had grown 12-fold, making the second largest economy in the world behind the United States. Does this mean China was going to become a hegemon? Well, some people, some international political economists, for example, William Robinson, who's from the Neo-Gramscian school, believes that China's ruling elites are a fraction of the so-called transnational capitalist class. So his view is that eventually, China will compete, but eventually it will all join together in some sort of transnationalized structure, joining the West. I'm of a different opinion, and I think that China's ambitions are not hegemonic. In fact, this speaker I mentioned to you before, who put a case at SOAS, he said, well, we've studied about hegemons before and they all end up in the same mess, and China wants to avoid that. So, maybe there's some truth in that, I don't know. China's leaders repeatedly emphasized China-led international institutions will be complementary to the existing structure. And if we look at the reality of China's investments and the kind of things it's doing through the BI, it desperately needs collaboration from other parts of the world, other developed parts of the world, Europe, the United States, and so on, because it can't carry this through on its own. And there's so much development and economic activity going on that, I think there's space for everybody to participate. And what I would suggest China is trying to do in a dollar-dominated world, in a unipolar US-dominated world, is that it's trying to create a parallel structure, because without that parallel structure, there's very little hope of China getting anywhere. And we can see this very much definitely with Iran, because I've been, as I say, I've been looking at this deal, and really for Iran to move forward, it's got to try and step as much as it can out of the US dominated system. And its only hope of development is to really be outside of that system. Not saying that it's going to totally reject it or it's going to kind of be an enemy of the West, but essentially, if these countries want the opportunities for development, they can't be regulated by a unipolar order that really, is designed to make sure that all the best advantages gravitate towards, relatively small global elite. What I've put a slide here now, must be coming to the end of my time, is I've just made a few points here of reading Brzezinski backwards. In fact, Brzezinski's view has now become a nightmare in some ways, because China and Russia have incredibly close links across the spectrum. They act in unison together in so many places, a few disagreements in Central Asia and so on, but they do work together. Russia's upgraded its military technology and is probably in some areas now superior to the United States. There is more sort of cooperation through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The other problem for the Brzezinski idea is that now the Middle East is increasingly sort of moving towards China and Russia. Saudi Arabia's largest customer is now China, not the United States, for example. And even Europe, there are tensions in Europe. Europe sat at this kind of between the epicenter of the unipolar world, the United States, and the epicenter of the multipolar world, which is Beijing. What does Europe do? Europe's got economies that are in recession, 40% unemployment in Spain and places like that, particularly among young people. If they're going to drag their economies out of these recessions, then there's a lot of real economic activity going on, or is going to carry on through the Belt and Road project. So maybe some sort of constructive engagement with China is a better policy than kind of backing off in fear. Now, what I've got here, I'm going to finish here because I think I must have come to the end of my time. I'm sorry I rushed through the last bit. Is that I've got a few maps here that just sort of, support some of the things. I've got some concluding thoughts and a bibliography, and one of the slides which has jumped, but I can't get back to it. I might be able to. Is just kind of the basics of my recent the article I'm writing on China and Iran and the strategic cooperation agreement. I'm going to publish this article soon, or at least I'll make it available through a website that I have on the Silk Roads with some friends. So if some of you would like to read that, but I do actually think this sort of more focused analysis of the Belt and Road gives you an idea of the the implications of this whole project and how it might work out. Right, okay, sorry I've rushed through this a little bit. There's quite a lot of material here, and I think we can open it up for discussion now. And Steve, how do I get back onto the screen where I can see you and everyone else? Hello? Stop presenting.
Sorry, George. Go to the little screen.
I can see you now. No, it's fine. I've got you now. That's great.
Great.
Okay.
Well, that was tremendous, George. I mean, it was a tour de force. You went through an awful lot of stuff, and I hope people managed to keep up with you.
Yeah, I'm sorry if, as I say, I went too quickly. I did try and cram a lot in.
Well, there are a couple of my students here, and you've hit a lot of the areas that I cover in my courses. Particularly, you mentioned the end of the structuralist import substitution industrialization phase, the neoliberal phase. You mentioned also some of the kind of more realist international relations theories around power and so on, which was great. There were a number of things that came up that occurred to me that were really important, and in particular, this idea of there being a turn in American thinking around China. You know, there was
Mm-hmm.
a period when a kind of more liberal internationalist view held that we should engage with China, bring China in to the international organizations, things like the World Trade Organization and so on, so that they begin to behave in ways that is compatible with the way we behave, and they'll eventually get the habits, and eventually they will liberalize politically as well as economically. Well, they seem to have rejected that idea now,
Mm-hmm.
and they've gone for more of a rivalry type relationship, which is fraught with the danger of this idea of a new Cold War. And rather than multipolarity, I kind of move back to bipolarity. So, I don't know. But anyway, other people want to ask a question of George.
I'll come back on your point if you like, Steve, if there
Yeah,
are
absolutely.
questions at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There was a change of heart, really, because I think the view was that China, the experience with the Soviet Union when it collapsed was it was dismembered, and the kind of the state wealth of the Soviet Union was distributed to the oligarchs. The oligarchs shifted that value. I mean, even Stieglitz's book is very good on this. That the immense hemorrhage of capital going out of the former Soviet Union into the international system. And I think probably, a lot of the sort of elite investors in the West imagine that, China would not collapse like that, but essentially it would have to be drawn into the international system, and China's elites and kind of, its entrepreneurs and so on that are at a very high level would become increasingly integrated. And as you suggest, joining the World Bank, all this sort of thing gave that indication. But I think a crucial change of decision, or maybe that decision was never taken. There was never a problem really. They never thought they would join the West. Was the 2008 financial crisis, because I certainly spoke to people at the time. I wasn't working on China then, but I think the view out of Beijing was that basically the international financial system was broken, and that if they were going to survive, then this was not the club to join. What they had to do was to build a parallel system, in fact to insulate themselves from the enormous problems. And one of the things they particularly identified was the fiat currencies in the West. We're going to have to basically quantitative ease to infinity, because there was going to be no way out of this crisis that had been produced in 2008, which was based on the accumulation of vast amounts of fictitious capital. So, I think the decision in Beijing, which had already been running, Keynesian type structures to keep the economy going, even though I'd call this a bifurcated Keynesianism, because the markets weren't at home but abroad. So my view is that, China at this point said, well, we've basically got to, we don't want to reject everything in the West, but we've got to create our own survival, our own environment.
Well, that's very interesting. So, in fact, the American change of mind is actually a response to a Chinese reconfiguration. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's true. I think that's true, because they gave them membership to the club, and then they trashed it. So I mean, or they went off and did something else.
Right. Okay. Hugh, were you signaling that you wanted to say something then?
Well, I was actually. Yes, a wonderful tour de force, George. Thank you very much.
That was very kind of you. Thank you.
A lot to digest there. I'd be fascinated to read your paper on Iran, one of my favorite countries of the world. I love going there. Not so easy these days. I'm interested in what you were talking about, what I call the dollar avoidance payment system, or evasion payment system. I've always thought that would happen. It's a question really of when the RMB really does become not necessarily the reserve currency, but a reserve currency. Do you think that this will happen, or when, or what will trigger it? We're moving that way, and I'm horrified by the politicization of the dollar and wire transfers and how that affects international trade. And I'd love to see the dollar being much less important in terms of world trade.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a really important, very good question, and not really addressed much by many people.
Yeah.
I think if you actually sort of look at what has been said about this, because they look at quantitative categories and what percentage of world trade is conducted in the dollar compared to what percentage of world trade is conducted in renminbi, then you've got this kind of very low level for renminbi and total predominance of the US dollar, even though it's gone down somewhat recently. And I don't think this is the real issue, because the problem, as I see it, is that the system that surrounds the dollar. When the United States came out of the Second World War, it had the right to be. The dollar had the right to be the global reserve currency. The United States was in an immensely powerful position, so that's not in question. But today, the problem is with the export of US industry, a US economy which has never been more unequal, the 2008 financial crisis, and then the United States printing huge amounts of money. Also a question mark over, large amounts of sort of debt in the United States, inferences of kind of dark pools of money running in trillions of dollars. So, the United States financial system that surrounds the dollar is probably not as strong and reliable as it used to be, and it has to defend the dollar militarily in many cases. So this is problematic to me. But what China has got is essentially what the United States had after the Second World War. At the time of the Bretton Woods Conference, China's got a massive productive industry, which the United States has got much less than it used to have. And it's not as competitive as it used to be. There's a huge amount of imports from China. Everything's produced in China. And also China is expanding, it's moving into other countries, which are going to give all sorts of opportunities for continuous expansion. And also what I think is tremendously important, but is often missed out, is China's got a vast amount of gold reserves. So, China could in some ways back its currency with gold if it needed to. But if it attempted to do that at this stage, it would break the financial system in the West, in my view. And it doesn't want that to happen. I think China wants to carefully manage its way into the international system, but it has all sorts of insurance policies there, like about 20,000 tons of gold.
Very interesting. Al's got his hand up. Al. You're on mute, Al. Al, you're on mute.
Yeah, we can't hear you. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, I can hear you now.
I can't see other people on cameras anymore, but I'll flick my camera on to show that I'm a real person and not a robot, that sort of stuff. As Steve said, the presentation was just fantastic. I mean, the information density was great. And I don't think it was too much, but of course, people can also listen to the recording afterwards to listen to, but it was impressive. And I do hope you go on and make it into a book. Because you practically got a book right there already. So that's pretty good. So there aren't too many questions to ask because you covered everything. So I want to throw out something which is a little bit speculative and just see what you think about it. If you read The Economist and Foreign Affairs, they're screaming, of course, about China rising, the end of U.S. hegemony. They're saying the U.S. has to maintain its hegemony, but it can't use sanctions. I mean, they're pointing out you can't use sanctions. It weakens sanctions the more you use them. China's building its own parallel financial institutions on the world basis, just as Hugh brought up, and as you were just saying, and also a technological thing. You can't do to them what we did to the Russians when we were against them, and we can't militarily invade them, at least not close to their own shore. So when they come down to it, what do these guys basically say? They just say you sort of have to wave your finger at them and talk about Western political values and democracy and stuff, but as the recent polls that come out show, the world's not very impressed by that. So the question I want to ask you, so the question is, what can the U.S. do? And not that you need to really help the U.S. I'm not really for that either, but what can the U.S. do to try to maintain its hegemony? And a model that comes to mind is the following, and especially because you have international political economy background, which I don't. I'm an economist. I'm wondering about the following. At least 50% of the capital, I mean, we could talk about it, is now in private hands in China. But there's no question that the party is directing how things are run. It's not the individual capitalists. We know when they step out of line, they get slapped down and stuff like that. But the question is, how long that is going to last. And especially I think about Latin America, and also I think about China in the past. You know, when the military steps in periodically to Latin America, and when the governments become dysfunctional and not able to, the danger of the military coming in is that all the interests which split the capitalist class then permeate the military, and the military is not able to do what it has to do, which would be a last resort against popular uprisings and stuff like that. And so, if you look at China in the past, as you know better than me, the Communist Party of China was often divided into 4 or 5 different factions that crippled China's ability, just like the militaries when they come into Latin America. Eventually, the different interests showed up in the military. You had infighting in the military, and then the military usually withdraws in order to get itself together again. And so that's my question. You have a particularly strong leader right now, and before him, the guys were not as strong as he is. And so what do you think about this idea that there's sort of something built into the rise of private capital accumulation, even though it's now dominated by, controlled by the Communist Party, that sooner or later they are going to, I mean, they're already allowed to enter the Communist Party, they are going to have presence and interest in the Communist Party, and that's going to lead to a re-rise of factions in the Communist Party, and that's going to break down the unity, which is such a key to what China's been able to do over the long period. So that's the question I'm asking. I mean, that would be some of the best hope that the West could have for breaking China's rapid rise to become at least equal to the West, if not eclipse it at some level. What are your thoughts on this? Is speculative. I do understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, obviously there's a lot of internal rivalry in China, but they don't advertise it. You know, there are factions in China moving from, you know, Marxist to kind of free market thinkers. There's a whole range in China. There's no question about that. But I think that, you know, the party has a united legitimacy on economic performance, and they've got to deliver. And I've spoken to several Chinese people, including officials, is that, you know, at the end of the day, as long as they've got a growing economy and as long as they are not letting inequality become excessive, and at least, you know, people who are probably poor now expect their children to be better off in the future, then, you know, that is the way. And if you look at the wording of the China Dream and some of the wording around the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, then this is really what China bases its kind of, or the Communist Party bases its survival on: economic performance, lifting people out of poverty, giving people opportunities, bringing all sorts of goods into play, consumer goods. You know, you can imagine all the people working abroad and so on. So there's a lot of economic activity going on. The whole thing's in motion. One of the biggest problems for me is corruption. Now, this has been a massive problem, you know, because any economy, not just because it's communist China, but any economy that goes through a phase of capitalist reconstruction and change at that sort of pace is going to face, you know, because you haven't got the mechanisms in place to control the whole thing. It's going crazy, you know, and you're not controlling it. And so many avenues for corruption. I think China's got to keep up its economic performance and also, you know, try and wind down at best its level of corruption, because those are the two crucial things. If the economic performance fails, they might be able to sustain themselves for a while, blame the West or whatever it might be. But then if corruption is still evident, then that is those are two really sensitive points, which if they come together could be very dangerous for the Communist Party. Now, looking at the United States, I think the problem with the United States is that, you know, with globalization, a transnationalized elite have come to power. They're the ones who took the jobs out of America, outsourced, took them to China, and the consequences for the United States. You know, we've only got to look at some simple statistics about inequality and the 1% and all this sort of thing, broken infrastructure, etc. So I think what the United States needs to do in many respects is that it has to actually engage constructively with what China's doing, because what China's offering is a vast amount of economic development. It's not excluding American investment. It wants it to come in fact. You know, it's not exclusionary. But I think if the United States insists on maintaining this unipolar hegemonic position, it's got a huge problem, because as Brzezinski says, you know, China and Russia get together and start pushing their influence on other parts of the world, then the position of the United States is going to be significantly weakened. So I think, you know, there needs to be a little bit of rethinking in Washington, engage with this project, And how do you control China? You control China by getting close to them, by controlling them when they start making investments, saying, no, you can't get away with that. You've got to go through these accounting standards and things like that. So my view is that constructive engagement is the way forward for the United States and Europe.
Let me just follow up on that real quickly, if I can, on the same point. First of all, I want to make very clear, I am not advocating for the United States to stop the rise of China. I'm very happy to say that.
No, I appreciate that.
I want to make that clear.
I'm aware of that, but I'm saying it is not a doable project.
Right. It's not doable anyways, but I'm not even advocating for it. The world would be much better if the U.S. hegemony is broken. But your point in corruption actually takes me to exactly the same point once again. The pie is getting very, very big, or it's going to get very, very big. It is already getting big, and it's going to get even bigger in China. And if you have corruption, and if you have private capital interests, and if they're rooted in the Communist Party, I mean, as long as the Communist Party does what it's doing, as long as it stays unified about providing growth. But if there's a big pie, and a lot of people have access to that pie, they can start to begin to think, well, yeah, there's a big pie, and I want to make sure I get my share of it. And so they don't immediately come out and say, screw the whole project. I'm against it. I'm just for myself. But little by little, they start saying that pie is pretty big. I want to make sure as much of it comes my way. And that's, of course, what private capital has an interest in doing. And so that's my concern again for the future of China, is that especially through corruption, as you say, but that corruption can go further than corruption. Corruption is not the problem in itself. Corruption becomes a real problem when it breaks the political unity of the party, which is able to control the direction that China goes. And that's what I'm wondering about.
Well, I think that, that was there was a danger point, it may be up to the first 2 years of President Xi.
Yeah.
If you look at the anti-corruption campaign,
yes.
Heads have rolled, which you would have thought wouldn't have rolled. So,
yes.
I think they realized that for the unity and survival of the party, there's no way the Communist Party can get away with being perceived as corrupt, both externally and internally. Because if they do that, then their legitimacy could be very rapidly undermined. And ordinary Chinese people talk about corruption. They have several words for it and so on. So they know it's there. They know it's existing all over the place. But if you see senior party officials that are talking about the China dream on one hand and involved in malfeasance on the other, I think that is something all the authorities in China fear. Because if they start going down that route, then they're going to have a lot of instability.
So I'll just end by saying again, I want to stress, I do hope you put this into a book, and then I'm looking for the movie to come out after that.
Oh, the movie. Well, you can join me on the movie. We'll do a good act. Yeah, thank you for those questions.
That's great.
Yeah, they're important questions as well.
Yeah, terrific conversation going on. I really appreciate the question as well. I mean, my view also is that you have as well as hard economics, there is also a sort of a value system that is kind of in play as well, which I think probably mitigates against certain aspects of the way China behaves. I mean, you have, there's a couple of observations. Number one, there is already a kind of new bloc developing. I mean, if you think about the extant communist systems, okay, you've got Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba. They are all now at different stages of moving towards this so-called, for want of a better term, market socialist system. Single party political control, and then a mixed economy with a greater freedom for private enterprise and market relations in supply and demand, at least at some level operating within the territory. A different kind of economic system to the neoliberal, more free market oriented system. So there is already a kind of bloc of those countries which are very closely politically allied. I mean, China and Cuba have relations that are not merely economic. They are deeply political. They, you know, the Communist Party of Cuba, the Communist Party of China have got fraternal relations. They've got delegations going backwards and forwards all the time, talking to one another. There's a very strong political realm here that is about, yes, challenging American hegemony. So it's not that there is a serious, you know, bifurcation, if you like, at that particular level. At another level, if you read Chinese scholarship on international relations, they are actually, you know, putting forward a kind of a Confucian notion of international relations, this idea of Xinsha, all under heaven and so forth. They as one paper I've got puts it, you know, they're following a strategy of not following a hegemonic principle as expressed in Western realist international relations theory. They are following a much more traditional Chinese notion of international relations, which does not necessitate hegemony in the sense that it's understood by, or dominance as it's understood in terms of power relations as they are conceived in Western international relations theory. And, you know, one guy puts it like the game of Mahjong, which is, you know, a strategy game. But unlike chess, where you knock the king over, Mahjong is kind of like won at the moment when the opponent realizes that strategically they can't win. You know, it's that point in the chess game where they give up rather than be defeated. They, you know, Mahjong is a much more subtle kind of approach to, you know. So what China's doing is, you know, like boiling frogs. It's getting itself into a position where the United States realizes the game's up. And then they kind of agree to allow China to be possibly just exist, you know, on its own terms without this challenge anymore. And then China would settle for that. They don't really want to dominate the United States. They don't want to take over the United States. They don't want to take over territory, but they want recognition for being, you know, the arbiter now of world power, if you like. They're not going to start a war, for example. They're just going to make themselves impregnable, make themselves impossible to defeat, rather than actually ever coming to blows. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. We'll probably come back on that. There are two things quickly that I would throw into there from the international political economy position that I have. You know, the era of nation states and to some extent international relations is a bit passé because, you know, capital is transnationalized and moved into extraterritorial space. And that, you know, even though we can talk about the United States, if we talk about the United States and consider the majority of its population, they're not benefited from globalization at all. So I would say what China is against is this transnationalized kind of, you know, operating system in finance and production and everything else, which has led to an immense condensation of power in the hands of a few elites. You know, I think Samuel Palmisano, the former head of IBM, talk about a globally integrated enterprise, the transnational corporations, as opposed to the multinational corporations. So I think China is reverting, as I say, going back to development, you can't escape globalization. It's taken place, but I think they're talking about globalization 2, which is connectivity, which is a lot of the things which already exist in globalization, but a return of power to sovereign nation states. There's a real big problem with transnationalization is that, you know, global lobbyists have far more power over governments than voters do. So we talk about the democratic deficit and all that sort of thing. So I think China is talking about globalization 2, and globalization 2 is basically a new Bretton Woods. It is going back to that structured order of the state private capital, but the private capital to some extent subservient to the state, something which very much took place in the Southeast Asian tigers and so on, and every model of development that has taken place has followed this particular route. And so China's set in this. Globalization's there, but it wants, if you like, to evade this transnationalized globalization, which it sees as a wrecking ball in the international system, and it sees the financial system in the West as broken and all those sorts of problems. Okay, so that's what I'd say for one thing. And the second thing that I would say as well, there's a very serious problem with the rise of China and also the cooperation with Russia. And that is, for the past 500 years or possibly more, power shifts and transitions and paradigm shifts have taken place within the West. You know, the power of the French, the Spanish, the British, the Pax Britannica, the Pax Americana, the American Empire, transnational globalization, the end of history, has all been a Western enterprise, you know, within the West, which has had power. You know, the Silk Roads were the past and all this sort of thing. And the West has had that power. Now a challenge is coming from some upstart country that is outside of the Western club. And I think that is shocking to many Western observers. This should not happen, you know. And I think these are two things that are problematic. China is saying we've got to move, and they talk about, in fact, new type great power relations that relates to what you're saying. You know, they want a new set of international relations. This is not hegemonic. This is not a hegemonic challenge. It's simply China wanting to help reorganize the international system so it doesn't blow up, basically. And it also allows for the survival of the Communist Party, of course.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Right, has anybody else got a question or a comment they'd like to make? Okay, George, I'm going to let you go because I know it must be 1:30 in the morning where you are. No doubt there is a bar still open in Oslo.
No, I just pass out after this, I think. All right. Well, Steve, many thanks again for organising this, and thank you for the people who joined and the excellent questions. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, despite being the early hours of the morning.
Terrific. So, okay. The audience was small, but it was good quality, I have to say. And yeah, and if one thing I could ask is, could you send me your slides?
Yeah, sure. I'll do
because the links in them are so interesting, and I'd like to be able to distribute it to the group.
Okay, yes, and I'll also give you access to my article I've just written on China and Iran and the deal, because I think that kind of just analyzes these things in a more microcosmic way.
Terrific, terrific.
Yeah, that's
well, great. Thanks a lot, George.
Pleasure.
Let's let you go. Thank you. We'll say goodbye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
And, we'll be in touch.
I hope we have occasion to meet again, even online. Yeah. Okay, goodbye.
Definitely, definitely. Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.